That night had started like any other ordinary evening in their apartment, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of routine that never suggested anything unusual was about to happen. He returned home later than expected, loosening his tie as he stepped inside without the usual warmth in his expression, passing her with a brief glance that felt distant and distracted. She noticed it immediately because she knew his patterns too well. He always used to greet her first, ask about her day, sometimes even joke about how tired he was, but tonight there was none of that familiarity, only a strange silence hanging between them. When she asked if he wanted dinner, he answered quickly that he had already eaten, not even pausing as if the conversation itself was an interruption to something more important happening in his mind. He kept checking his phone repeatedly, turning the screen slightly away from her each time a notification appeared, and that small gesture alone made something uncomfortable tighten inside her chest. Moments later, another message lit up his screen, and she caught a shift in his expression that he couldn't hide fast enough, as if he had been pulled out of their shared reality into another world she wasn't part of. Without explaining anything properly, he grabbed his keys and said he had to go back out for a while, avoiding her eyes completely as he moved toward the door, and she simply stood there watching it close, unaware that this was the final night their marriage would still feel normal. That uneasy feeling kept growing inside her long after he had left, turning the quiet apartment into a space that suddenly felt heavier than usual, and as she sat on the edge of the sofa replaying his behavior in her mind, she started noticing how many small things she had ignored in recent weeks without realizing their importance, like the way he had begun laughing less around her, or how his replies had become shorter even during conversations that used to last for hours, or how he seemed constantly preoccupied even when physically present beside her, as if part of him was always somewhere else. At first she had told herself that this was just the pressure of work and responsibilities building up before something important in his career, but now those explanations felt weak and uncertain, because when she connected all those moments together, they no longer looked random but like pieces of a pattern she had refused to see, and that realization made her feel strangely unsettled. As she stood up and walked slowly toward the window, staring outside at the quiet night streets while trying to convince herself that she was overthinking, even though deep inside a voice was already telling her that something in her life was no longer as stable as it once seemed. As the night moved forward and the silence inside the apartment deepened, her thoughts refused to settle, and instead kept circling back to the same uneasy questions she didn't want to fully form in her mind, because every time she tried to push them away, another memory would surface to pull her back, like the recent evenings when he would sit beside her but feel emotionally absent, scrolling through his phone with unusual focus, or the times he would smile at messages she couldn't see and then quickly hide his screen the moment she looked in his direction. She had always trusted him enough not to question these behaviors too deeply, believing that trust meant not overthinking every small detail, but tonight that belief felt fragile, almost naive, as she stood in front of the kitchen counter without realizing how long she had been there, her hands resting on the surface while her mind replayed every recent interaction between them like scattered fragments trying to form a picture she was not ready to accept. And even though no clear truth had been revealed yet, something inside her had already started shifting in a way that could not be reversed, as if her instincts were quietly preparing her for a reality she had not yet fully seen but was no longer able to completely ignore either. By the time she finally forced herself to sit down again, the apartment felt even quieter than before, not because there was no sound, but because her mind had started amplifying every small detail into something heavier, and in that stillness she began remembering how their relationship had once felt so different, so natural, where conversations flowed without effort and even silence between them felt comfortable instead of tense. But now even silence felt suspicious, as if it was hiding something she had not yet uncovered. She thought about how recently he had stopped sharing small parts of his day with her, how he would answer questions in a rushed tone and then immediately shift his attention elsewhere, and how he had started keeping parts of his life completely separate without any explanation. And while none of these things alone were enough to confirm anything, together they created a growing discomfort she could no longer ignore because for the first time she found herself questioning not just his behavior, but the gap that seemed to be forming between who he used to be and who he was becoming right in front of her, leaving her trapped between trust and doubt in a way that made even her own thoughts feel uncertain. It was near midnight when the shift from suspicion to reality began, though at first it didn't announce itself loudly or dramatically, but arrived in the form of something small and ordinary that she would normally have ignored, as his phone, left briefly on the table while he was in the shower, lit up with a notification that broke the stillness of the room, and although she had never been the type to invade his privacy, something about that moment felt different, almost unavoidable, as if her mind was no longer willing to stay in the dark, She hesitated for a long time, staring at the screen as the glow faded and reappeared again, and when another message preview appeared with a tone that felt too personal, too familiar, her heart tightened in a way she couldn't explain, because the words she caught were not the kind a stranger would send, nor the kind a colleague would write, and despite telling herself to step away, her hand moved before her thoughts could fully resist reaching for the phone, as if some invisible force had already decided what she needed to see, and in that single decision, without fully understanding it yet, she crossed into a truth that would change everything she believed about the man she loved. The moment she unlocked the phone, it felt as if the air around her had suddenly become heavier, almost suffocating, because what she expected to be a simple misunderstanding or harmless conversation immediately turned into something far more disturbing as her eyes adjusted to the screen and she saw an entire thread of messages stretching far beyond a single interaction. At first she tried to read calmly, telling herself there must be a reasonable explanation, but the tone of the messages quickly erased that hope because they were not casual or professional in any way. They carried emotional closeness, familiarity, and an intimacy that made her stomach tighten as she kept scrolling further despite her hands beginning to shake, revealing conversations that had clearly been ongoing for weeks if not longer, filled with references to meetings she was never part of, moments she never knew existed, and plans that had been made behind her back with a level of comfort that felt like a direct betrayal of everything she believed about their relationship. And as the truth slowly unfolded in front of her, she realized this was not a misunderstanding or a single mistake, but something deliberate, something hidden, and something that had been growing quietly while she was still trusting him completely. She didn't even realize when the tears started forming because her focus stayed locked on the screen, as if looking away would make everything disappear, but the more she read, the clearer the reality became, and by the time she heard the bedroom door open behind her, she already felt like she was standing on the edge of something that could not be reversed. When he walked into the room and saw her holding his phone, the change in his expression was immediate, a flicker of shock followed by an attempt to regain control of the situation, but the silence between them was already too loud, filled with everything that had just been discovered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady in a way that surprised even her, asking him how long it had been going on, a simple question that carried the weight of everything she no longer needed to say, and instead of a clear answer, she was met with hesitation, shifting explanations, and broken sentences that tried to soften the truth without fully admitting it. But every word he spoke only confirmed what she had already understood in her heart, that the life she believed in had been quietly shared with another reality she was never meant to see. After his incomplete explanations faded into silence, the room felt strangely frozen, as if even time had slowed down to witness what was happening between them, and she found herself no longer reacting with shock the way she expected she would, because something inside her had already detached from emotion and moved into a calmer, sharper clarity that frightened her more than tears ever could. She stood up slowly, still holding the phone, not because she needed it anymore but because it felt like proof she couldn't let go of yet, and as she walked toward the window she noticed how normal everything outside still looked. The distant lights, the quiet streets, the steady rhythm of a world that had no idea her entire life had just split into before and after. While behind her he tried speaking again, trying to fill the silence with explanations that now felt meaningless, but she didn't turn back, because every sentence he said only added weight to the realization that this wasn't confusion or a mistake anymore, it was a choice that had already been made long before this moment, and now all that remained was the consequence she had to decide how to face. The hours that followed didn't feel like normal time anymore, as if the night had stretched itself into something heavier and slower just to trap her in the space between decision and denial, where every thought came back to the same question she couldn't escape: what does she do now? And yet no answer felt simple enough to hold, because on one side there was the life she had built with him, filled with memories that still felt real despite everything she had discovered, and on the other side, there was a truth so sharp it made those same memories feel uncertain in hindsight. She sat alone for a long time, going over everything again and again, trying to separate emotion from reality, trying to understand where trust had broken without her noticing, and while he stayed in another room waiting for her reaction, she felt something inside her slowly shifting from confusion to acceptance, not of what he did, but of what it meant, because once trust is broken in a way that cannot be repaired, love stops being enough to hold two lives together, and in that quiet realization she began to understand that whatever choice came next would not be about saving the relationship, but about saving herself. By the time morning light started to filter into the room, she no longer felt like the same person who had entered that night holding on to a version of love she thought was unbreakable, because now everything felt stripped down to something simpler but far more painful: clarity without comfort. The house was slowly coming alive again, with sounds of movement outside and the distant expectation of a wedding day that everyone believed was still going to happen. But inside her, there was no longer any illusion left to maintain, only a quiet certainty forming in place of confusion, and when she finally made her decision, it didn't come with drama or emotional chaos, but with a calmness that surprised even her, as if she had already lived through the worst part of it in silence. She stood up, prepared herself not for celebration but for truth, and walked into a future that no longer included pretending, because she understood that continuing would only mean abandoning herself, and as she chose to step away from everything that had been planned, she realized that sometimes the most powerful decision a person can make is not to fight for what is broken, but to walk away from it before it breaks them completely. When she finally stepped out of the room and into the space where everyone else was preparing for what they believed would be the happiest moment of her life, there was no visible sign on her face of the storm she had just survived internally, yet something about her silence felt different enough that even the people closest to her began to notice an unusual stillness in her behavior, as if she was no longer participating in the atmosphere around her but observing it from a distance. The wedding preparations continued outside with guests arriving, conversations building, and expectations quietly growing, but she moved through it all without reacting to any of it the way she was supposed to, and when she finally reached the point where she was expected to continue forward into a life she no longer recognized as hers, she stopped, not suddenly or dramatically, but with a controlled certainty that made the shift even more powerful, and in that moment the confusion spread through the gathering like a ripple, because no one could understand why she was no longer walking toward the future that had been prepared for her, while he stood at the end of the aisle realizing, perhaps too late, that something irreversible had already taken place long before she ever reached that point. In the silence that followed, everything that had been carefully planned around her began to lose its structure, not because of chaos or shouting, but because of a single decision that changed the direction of the entire moment, as she stood there no longer as a bride stepping into a ceremony, but as someone choosing her own reality over the one that had been arranged for her. People around her reacted in waves of confusion and disbelief, some trying to understand what had gone wrong while others simply watched in shock as the meaning of the day shifted in front of them, but she no longer looked for approval or explanation from anyone in the room, because her attention was no longer tied to the expectations of others. When she finally turned away, it was not with anger or revenge, but with a quiet strength that came from accepting a truth that had been too painful to ignore, and as she walked out of the venue, leaving behind the life that had just collapsed in silence, she realized that what he thought was a single mistake had actually cost him something far greater than he understood in that moment. Someone who had loved him completely but refused to lose herself in the process.